Okay, so today we're going deep on something pretty heavy. Neocolonialism. You brought up this issue of no Varetsesna mai Shiltanadoa.
Right.
That's modern national thought for folks who don't speak Polish.
Right, right.
And they have this whole take on neocolonialism, basically saying it's just a modern way to keep countries dependent.
Yeah. Exploitation, they called it.
Exploitation, exactly. So we're going to unpack all that, see what they're really getting at, and honestly, what stands out, for you listening.
Absolutely.
What are the big takeaways here?
Yeah, and you shared excerpts from NMN and our 2934.pdf.
Right.
Which is, it's a collection of, well, they're not afraid to tackle big ideas.
Yeah.
Neocolonialism, of course, but they get into, like, proletarian nations, what that even means.
Right.
China's rise, is the West declining, some reflection on Poland's history, even biopolitics gets some mention in there.
Wow.
So a lot of ground to cover.
Okay, so first things first. This journal's not messing around. They're saying neocolonialism. It's different from the old school colonialism.
Right.
So how do they draw that line? What's the big difference for them?
Well, it's really interesting. They zero in on how the methods have changed.
Okay.
Like, we all know traditional colonialism, right? It was boots on the ground.
Yeah, taking over straight up.
Exactly. Military occupation, laws that were designed to discriminate, just blatant subjugation.
Right.
But their argument is neocolonialism, it's subtler.
Okay.
It's more about using your economic power, your political influence, even military might, but without those old school, like, legal empires.
Interesting.
So on paper, nations look equal.
Yeah.
But the power dynamics, totally different story. And this actually connects to something called dependency theory.
Okay.
Which has been around for a while, but it basically says the way less developed countries' economies work, it's shaped by their relationship with the bigger, richer nations.
So it's like they're not really free to make their own choices, even if they technically, on paper.
Right. They have the sovereignty, but
yeah.
Yeah, the agency is limited, and that ties into their whole concept of proletarian nations, which you can get into.
Yeah, we'll definitely dig into that. So it's not about physically occupying a country anymore.
Right.
It's more about controlling, I don't know, like the economic engine.
Yeah, like the puppet master.
Right. You don't see the strings, but they're there.
Exactly. And that's why they say it's so hard to spot neocolonialism.
Yeah.
Because it often comes disguised as helpful stuff, Aid packages, foreign investment, expert advice.
Oh, sure.
Sounds good on the surface, right?
Right.
But they use this analogy. Imagine a kid who's always given candy.
Okay.
Seems like a treat, a nice gesture.
Yeah.
But what happens? The kid never learns to eat real food.
Right. They never become self-sufficient.
Exactly. They depend on that candy.
Wow, that's a good analogy. Okay, so they also talk about Józef Kosecki and his idea of social cybernetics. For those of us who aren't, academics.
Right.
How does that help us understand this whole neocolonialism thing?
Well, Józef Kosecki, he was a big deal in Poland, a scholar.
Okay.
Worked in this field of social cybernetics. Now, cybernetics, in a nutshell, it studies how complex systems are controlled and communicate.
Okay.
And Kosecki, he applied this to societies.
So, like, how a whole society is controlled, influenced.
Exactly. Who has the power? How does it flow?
Right.
And the journal, they use his models, his theories, to map out those relationships, especially when you've got this imbalance of power.
Right, the neo-colonial situation.
Exactly. It helps us see the mechanism.
The system.
Yeah, the systems, the dependencies. It's not just random stuff happening.
Right. It's deliberate.
Okay,
so let's get into the nitty-gritty. How does neocolonialism actually play out in the real world, according to this journal?
Right.
They talk about these proletarian nations.
Yes.
Can you break down what they mean by that?
This is a big one for them, and it's definitely provocative.
Okay.
So proletarian nations, in their view, these are countries, they're officially independent. They got their flag, their seat at the UN, all that.
Right.
But materially, they depend on richer countries.
So they're not really in control of their own destiny.
Well, they use this comparison to the proletariat in, like, classic Marxist theory.
Okay.
Workers who are technically free, but they don't own the means of production.
Right, the factories, the tools.
Exactly. So they rely on the capitalists, and for these proletarian nations, it's the same. They might not have the economic clout, the political weight to really negotiate fair deals on the world stage.
So they're kind of stuck taking what they can get.
In a way, yeah. Just to survive economically.
Wow. Okay, so they've got the symbols of a nation, but...
Yeah, but the economic reality is different.
Very different. And then they get into the specific tactics, right?
Yeah.
How this dependence is kept in place.
Right. Whether it's intentional or just how the system works, that's debatable. Sure. But one thing they focus on is this idea of creating like compliant elites.
Ooh, that sounds kind of sneaky. Like building allies from the inside.
It can be seen that way, yeah. So their argument is richer countries, those international institutions, they foster loyalty among the elites of these neocolonial states.
Yeah.
And they do it in various ways. Scholarships to study abroad,
Oh, sure.
Prestigious universities, jobs in international organizations.
Okay.
Which often push, a particular worldview.
Right.
Even just subtle stuff like media, cultural exchanges.
Shaping how they think.
Exactly. So these elites, they're educated in the system. They rise within it.
And they start to see things the same way.
Yeah, they internalize the priorities of the dominant powers.
So it becomes self-reinforcing.
Right. And that makes it easier to influence things without being heavy-handed.
Right. You don't need to force anything because the people in charge already agree with you.
Basically, yeah. And they also talk a lot about mass media.
Oh, yeah. That's a powerful tool.
Hugely powerful. They argue it can create a false consciousness among the general population.
Okay. What does that mean? Exactly.
Well, it's not necessarily about, like, straight-up propaganda.
Okay.
It's more insidious. It's about shaping desires, what people think they should want.
Aspirations.
Exactly. They give the example of the American way of life.
Oh, yeah. That gets pushed everywhere.
It's presented as the ideal, something to strive for.
Right.
And what does that lead to? Wanting American products, American culture.
Right. Buying into the whole system.
And that reinforces the dependence.
It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy almost. Okay. So what about this idea of development, progress? The journal seems skeptical about how that gets used.
Yeah, they're pretty critical.
Yeah.
Because they say, look, you see this in neocolonies. People have more stuff.
Consumer goods?
Yeah, they're buying more. Seems like they're better off. But the journal's point is, do they own the means of production?
Right. Are they actually in control of their own economy?
Exactly. Do they have the factories, the technology?
Well, real power.
The real power, yeah. Often that's still in the hands of the
neocolonial power.
the neocolonial power. So it looks like progress, but
But it's superficial.
yeah, it's not sustainable.
Okay. And they use Poland as an example.
Right, a case study.
They flat out call it a neocolony.
Right.
What's their argument then?
Well, this is where it gets really specific and, some might say controversial.
Yeah.
So they say Poland, especially since 1989.
Post-communist era.
Right, it's become a neocolony mainly influenced by the USA, Germany, Israel.
A Bermuda Triangle, they call
Yeah,
it.
yeah, that's their term. And their point is crucial Polish industries, like shipbuilding, they were either intentionally weakened or just allowed to die, while Poland became this huge market for foreign goods.
Right, so consuming instead of producing.
Exactly. They argue that's killed Poland's chance for real economic independence.
Wow. Okay, so that claim about intentionally weakening industries, that's pretty strong. Do they give specific evidence?
Well, it's more that they see it as the result of decisions, policies.
Influence.
Influence, yeah. Not necessarily like documented cases of sabotage.
Okay, so it's their interpretation of how things have played out.
Right, more about the overall trend.
Okay. Now, they also get into this whole cybernetic view of sovereignty.
Right.
Sounds very technical.
It is a bit.
So how does that framework help us understand different levels of, how independent a country really is?
Well, this is where Kosecki's stuff becomes useful.
Okay.
So they lay out 4 models, different levels of control.
Okay.
First, you've got the steered system,
Okay.
which they say is basically a classic colony.
No independence at all.
Right. The system, meaning, the country, it's totally dependent on an outside power.
For everything.
For everything. Resources, information, even what decisions to make. Their example is, starkly, a concentration camp. Totally controlled from the outside.
No internal decision-making.
Nope. Then there's the controllable system,
Okay.
which they equate to a colony, but maybe a little more developed,
Okay.
or an occupied country. They can generate their own resources, these countries.
Okay.
But the big decisions, where to steer the ship,
Right.
that still comes from outside.
So they have an engine but no steering wheel.
Exactly. Then you've got the self-steering system.
Okay.
This is where it gets tricky. And they say this is classic neocolonialism.
Interesting.
So these systems, they can manage their resources, process information.
Okay.
They have what they call a corrector, meaning they can adapt to some degree,
Yeah.
but they're still heavily influenced by an external organizer.
Through, like, feedback loops.
Exactly. Think of it like a thermostat. It regulates the temperature, right?
Yeah.
But someone else set it, and they can change it whenever they want.
So it looks independent, but it's not really.
Precisely. And then finally, you've got the autonomous system.
Okay.
This is the ideal.
True sovereignty.
True sovereignty. They've got this thing called a homeostat. It's like the internal control center, the brain of the operation.
Makes its own decisions.
Exactly. Regulates itself,
Yeah.
can change based on circumstances, acts in its own best interest, no puppet master.
So a sovereign state, in this model, it's like a fully self-driving car.
I like that analogy.
Right. It knows where it's going. It can adjust to traffic, all that.
Exactly. It can maintain its equilibrium, its balance.
And they tie this back to Poland, right?
Yeah.
Saying since '89, it's been lacking that homeostat.
Yeah, they argue it's more in that self-steering mode.
Dependent.
Dependent.
Wow. Okay, so they also talk about this whole global power shift.
Yeah.
The West declining, the global South rising, especially with China.
Right.
What's their evidence for that?
Well, they say we're seeing a fundamental change in who's calling the shots.
Okay.
And they point to groups like BRICS.
Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa.
Right. And the SDO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. They say these are signs of a move away from the old power structures.
Like NATO, the G7.
Exactly. And to back this up, they have this whole section called, like, a chronicle of global geostrategic changes.
Right, a list of specific events.
Yeah, a timeline from late 2022 into early 2023.
Okay, so what are some of the big ones they highlight?
Well, for example, Lula becoming president again in Brazil.
Okay.
They see that as a potential shift in South America.
Away from the U.S.
Potentially, yeah. Also, in Germany, there's been talk of getting rid of the veto power in the EU.
Interesting.
Which could shake things up within Europe itself.
Yeah, big time. Anything else?
Yeah, they note a bunch of things that suggest, like, traditional Western alliances are weakening.
Okay.
Or that non-Western countries are getting closer. Like Poland, they mentioned the deal with Germany for Patriot missiles.
Right.
But they frame it as Germany increasing its influence.
Interesting take.
Yeah. And then you have things like Russia getting cozy with South Africa, securing military stuff in Sudan, Burkina Faso, Mali. They're ditching military agreements with France.
Wow.
Saying they want to choose their own partners, which includes Russia.
So a rejection of the old colonial powers.
That's how the journal sees it.
Asserting their independence.
Exactly.
Okay, what else is on their list?
Well, they talk about Iran and Russia linking their banking systems. The whole Chinese balloon incident with the U.S. Human Rights Watch, accusing the U.K. and U.S. of colonial crimes over Diego Garcia.
Okay, so a mixed bag of things.
Yeah, but their point is it all points in the same direction.
Okay.
Then you've got BRICS countries doing joint military exercises, Russia and China having all these high-level meetings talking about their partnership, Iran agreeing to give Syria air defense systems, Iranian warships showing up in Brazil even though the U.S. wasn't happy about it.
Wow.
And a lot of economic stuff, too.
Okay, like what?
Well, Belarus is doing more with both China and Iran economically. Honduras opened up diplomatic ties with China. Germany and Japan are having talks about supply chains and security. Xi Jinping went to Moscow. And Putin was, like, really emphasizing how strong the Russia-China relationship is.
Right.
Big on that. Oh, and this is interesting. China and France did a liquefied natural gas deal, but they used yuan, not dollars.
Wow, that's a big deal.
And apparently, the yuan has overtaken the dollar for China's cross-border transactions.
So they're trying to move away from the dollar.
It seems that way. Then there's the Macron and von der Leyen visits to China.
Right.
They got treated very differently.
Yeah, I remember that.
Which the journal says shows China's focus on, like, one-on-one relationships.
Not dealing with the EU as a bloc.
Exactly. And Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, he went on this whole Latin America tour.
Okay.
Saudi Arabia and Syria are patching things up. They even had talks with Turkey, Russia, Iran. Argentina's using yuan to pay for Chinese imports. Raisi, the Iranian president, visited Syria. Oh, and there was a meeting between Lavrov and his Chinese counterpart at an SKO thing. Saudi Arabia reopened their embassy in Syria. And at this EU Indo-Pacific forum, apparently a lot of global South countries were hesitant to, like, team up against China.
So not everyone's on board with the West's agenda.
Seems that way. And then you have the UN rapporteur saying Israel treats Palestinian territories like colonies. Iran and Egypt are talking again. Iraq banned the U.S. dollar for domestic transactions. Iran and Russia are building a railway together. More national currencies being used for trade between Russia and China. Central African Republic might get a Russian military base. Venezuela wants to join BRICS. Pakistan is doing barter trade with Afghanistan, Iran, Russia.
It's a lot of bypassing the Western-led system.
Right.
Okay.
And it goes on. More economic cooperation between Belarus and Cuba, Iran and Venezuela. Raisi went to Nicaragua and Cuba, talked about ending U.S. hegemony. The Palestinian president went to China. China told the UK to recognize Argentina's claim on the Falklands. Some EU stuff, too, about capital markets. Von der Leyen went to Latin America, but there was pushback on trade deals. Germany wants to station troops permanently in Lithuania.
It's a lot.
It's a lot. But their point is, all this, it's a global decolonization happening.
Power shifting away from the West.
Exactly.
Wow. Okay, so they also get into Western values, right? Like freedom, sovereignty.
Yeah, they say they value those things, but they're critical of how the West uses them.
Okay.
Their argument is these values have become like slogans.
To cover up their own agenda?
Right.
Right.
Western hegemony, basically. And they say that the way the West has acted, with all these interventions, wars, it's actually damaged the reputation of those values.
Especially in the global South.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so they're seeing a pushback. People wanting respect for their own cultures, their way of doing things.
Not just blindly following the West.
Right.
Okay, and then they bring it back to Central Europe.
Right. Poland specifically.
And how that fits into all of it.
Yeah. Well, they look at it through the lens of history.
German domination.
Yeah, colonization, influence, all that.
Good.
And then they make this interesting argument. They say the EU, the way it is now, it's kind of like a neocolonial project.
With Germany at the top.
Yeah, wanting to be the boss of a sovereign Europe, they say.
Interesting.
But they end on a hopeful note.
Okay.
They say this awakening that's happening in China in the global South,
Yeah.
they think it'll spread to Europe too.
So countries like Poland will break free.
That's their hope. True independence, internal and external.
Wow. Okay, so that's a lot to digest.
It is, yeah.
Basically, they're saying neocolonialism, it's real, it's subtle, it's everywhere, and the world's power structure is changing.
Yeah, in a big way.
And for you, our listener, the learner, we hope this has given you a new way to look at things.
Absolutely.
A framework for understanding power, who has it, how it's used.
And, for you to think about, as we wrap this up, this cybernetic model, those four systems, the different levels of control.
Yeah.
What would it actually take for a nation to move from that dependent state?
The neocolony.
Yeah, to become truly autonomous.
In this world, in the 21st century.
What would have to change, internally, externally?
That's the big question.
It is.
And one we hope you'll keep thinking about. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for listening.